r/AskReddit. Lawyers of Reddit, what's your best most badass I rest my case moment? Not a case-winning moment, but a motion-winning one for sure. Think of cases like a big conflict, with motion hearings as little conflicts. Opposing attorney was insisting that Rula meant they could do X. I tried, multiple times, to point out Rula literally did not say that. During the hearing, the judge reached behind them, grabbed their rules of civil procedure, basically a dictionary of rules, placed it in front of the other attorney, and said, "Show me where Rula says X." Other attorney did not take the hint, read rules out loud for a brutal 5 minutes, and gave the book back. I said, "Judge, I have nothing to add." It was pretty fun. I was on the losing end of this one. I was representing a pro bono defendant who was attempting to regain custody of her children. The family division attorney was laying out his case to the judge for why my client wasn't ready, and his final point was that my client had refused emotional counseling to avoid violent fits of rage that she had inflicted on her children. On cue, my client jumps up screaming, "Fark you, judge lady. You a stupid cunt. Fark you all for taking my farkin' kids, you farkin' cunts." I just caught the opposing attorney's smirk of satisfaction as I got up to usher my client out of the courtroom. When I was in law school, I had to argue a case for an exam. I was the last in my class to go, so there wasn't anyone arguing against me. I opened with a motion to dismiss since opposing had failed to show. The judge grading me chuckled and said, "Touché, counsel." I still had to go forward, but we got off on the right foot and I ended up with an A. Corporate lawyer, so I don't have cases to rest. But once opposing counsel was forcefully insisting that it was ridiculous for me to expect a certain provision in a contract we were negotiating, and I pointed out that this provision was standard in his own firm's contract forms, as I knew from several prior transactions I'd worked on across from them. Pretty exciting stuff. He took it in stride and said, jokingly, "Well, of course it's fine when we ask for it." Ian Albert, I was in traffic court one time and saw a lawyer straight up murder a cop with words. The cop had previously testified that the weather on the night of the traffic stop was heavy rain and winds so strong that the defendant could only open his window 3 inches, and that the car had stopped on an area with very little shoulder, forcing the cop to approach from the passenger side, not the driver's side. The cop had then testified that he smelled a strong smell of alcohol on the defendant's breath. When the defense lawyer got up, he repeated what the cop had said almost verbatim and asked how he could have possibly smelled alcohol on the breath of someone on the other side of the car, through a 3 inches crack in the window, on a night with pouring rain and strong winds. The cop sort of opened and shut his mouth a few times, squirmed around in his seat, and said, "That's just what I always write in my log, to remind me that it was a DUI stop." The judge threw the case out. No motion to dismiss needed. Then he took a break and called the traffic prosecutor and the cop into his office. I'm guessing it wasn't for a nice spot of tea and some scones. Opposing counsel decided that I had coached my witness and gave him lines to repeat, that he was lying. Short version is that he asked the witness if he spoke to me before he testified. Witness said he had. Attorney looked like he thought he has me. Attorney asked the witness what I told him, what instructions I gave him. Witness looked him dead in the eye and said, "First thing he told me was to tell the truth no matter what. He said the lawyer is never the one who goes to jail, that he isn't going to jail for me, and if I lie, I'm on my own." Attorney looked like someone took the air out of him. Everyone in the courtroom simultaneously looked at me. Only time I've smirked or laughed in court. I wanted to put my feet up on the table like I was Vincent LaGuardia Gambini, hands behind my head, and say, "I'm done with this guy." Wasn't really I rest my case moment, but it was a good one. A few years back, my brother and I moved into this quiet apartment building. The property managers catered to the helicopter pilots who lived above us. Meanwhile, my brother and I were correction officers at the time. We kept getting the blame for our loud neighbor. Had a shitty day at the jail, come home to find an eviction notice on our door, stating that we have 10 days to get out of the apartment. We stayed, and hired a lawyer for the tribunal hearing. Our lawyer during the hearing: "I understand you have helicopter pilots living in the building. Well, these gentlemen are correction officers and have to be up early in the mornings as well. Are you telling me their jobs are not as important?" The two property manager ladies were stunned with that question. Lawyer continued, "So if we follow through with this eviction, we have to get all the complainants to take the day off of work to come in for this? Are you willing to make these people do that?" The two property managers were totally unprepared for this guy. The tribunal guy was even impressed. Felt pretty good to beat them at their own game. The two managers asked our lawyer in front of us and the tribunal guy, "If we ever have any more issues with these two tenants, can we hire you?" He kinda chuckled at them and said, "I fight for the little guy." My client and his wife were woken up one night because people were trying to break into his house. He fired 2 warning shots as his wife called 911. The neighbor also called 911. When the police got the neighbor's call that there were shots fired, the police sergeant radioed the other officers and said, "He's going to jail tonight," referring to my client. So obviously, even with signs of someone trying to break in and his wife calling 911 for help, the officers arrest my client for endangering his wife by shooting inside the house, nowhere near her. It gets to a jury trial and I start to go off on the police sergeant about why she would say that before an investigation and before she even had any idea what happened. The sergeant had no idea how to respond and literally just sat there staring at me for a solid 2 minutes before saying anything. Even the bailiffs were audibly laughing. I was trying a criminal sexual conduct case. My client was a stepfather of a 13-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. Allegedly, my client fingered her on the living room couch while the 8-year-old boy was in the room with him watching TV. Mom was in a rehab facility for drug and alcohol abuse. My theory of the case was that the girl made the case up because my client refused to pay for modeling classes for the girl. The boy testified and said he saw the criminal act from where he was sitting on a recliner. On cross-examination, I asked how he could see what happened since the lights were low, nighttime, and my client, who is 6 foot tall and weighs 200 pounds, was in between them. He said that his story was what he was told to say by the sister and the prosecutor's victim coordinator. The prosecutor rested her case. I shut up and sat down. I presented no defense and it took the jury 3 minutes to find him not guilty. I once had an appeal where the precedent, all from other circuit courts, was very bad for me. The circuit court I was arguing in front of had a decision that was very good for me, but it was unpublished, meaning that it was not precedential. My goal was to convince the court to follow its unpublished decision, not the decisions of the other circuits. During my argument I cited the unpublished decision. One of the judges interrupts me and asks, "But wasn't that decision unpublished?" I answered yes, but it was well reasoned. He replied with a self-effacing quip, "I was on the panel for that decision, so it couldn't have been that well reasoned." The audience laughed a bit. I answered quickly, "In that case, Your Honor, it was at least well written." The audience, and all the judges, burst into laughter. I ended up winning in a published decision, which turned the old unpublished decision into binding precedent. A bit of humor can go a long way in the courtroom, especially when you're flattering the judges. I'm relatively junior, so I'm hoping to beat this one day. I defend professionals and brought a motion to dismiss a case on the basis that the plaintiff could not prove my client was negligent as she had not served the required expert evidence. As opposing counsel and I waited for our motion to be heard, we were sitting in the courtroom. The judge, who I did not know and who had not read our materials, wanted to talk to the parties of a short trial which was to be heard after our motion was argued. That matter was also a professional negligence matter and the plaintiffs had no expert support. The judge then spent 10 minutes explaining that he had practiced in professional negligence for many years and was well versed in the evidentiary requirements to prove the elements of professional negligence. In fact, he said, "I very rarely use the word impossible in this courtroom, but it is impossible for you to be successful without expert evidence." Our matter was then called and I reveled in explaining to the judge that he was about to hear a motion to dismiss a professional negligence case on the basis that the plaintiff had no expert evidence. I won. I do mostly solicitor work, so if I'm doing my job right I don't get a whole lot of these type of moments. That being said, I had a long-time client who was being sued and I got to shut down the guy suing him in a very satisfying way. So my client had hired a guy, we will call Kevin, as basically a right-hand man for his company. The employment contract wasn't done yet, but they had an agreement that Kevin would work 6 weeks at a lower wage and then sign the contract and get the agreed-upon wage. So the guy works decently for 5 weeks and then is given the contract to sign. He comes back to the owner, my client, and says that he has some small changes he would like to make. When the owner gets the contract back, he finds that the small changes involve removing the duties and responsibilities section, basically the job description, and the non-compete/confidentiality clause. Not only that, but he has written in a higher salary than agreed and added a bunch of new benefits for himself. Obviously, my client tells him that he can either sign the contract as it was originally laid out or he can find himself another job. He takes the latter option. But he starts a lawsuit against the owner wanting to be paid for the 6 weeks he was supposed to work, which had already been paid, 2 weeks in lieu of notice and 5 weeks vacation pay. I got the enjoyable job of telling Kevin, in front of a judge that he was not entitled to anything under the employment legislation and the only way he could get any of that would be if he had signed the contract. Judge dismissed the case and awarded costs to the defendant, but not before giving Kevin a lecture on wasting the court's time.
I'd love it if you liked and subscribed.